Did you know that U.S. teacher candidates in colleges and universities can do their student teaching overseas? What an opportunity, right? Well, we reached out to Dr. Danielle Carrier, an old friend of Audrey's from when they were in Singapore together, to get the scoop on how can our young teachers take that first step into possibly being an international educator by getting some experience teaching overseas. So learn more about Dr. Danielle Carrier, who is a professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Southern Mississippi, through our show notes where we have a full biography of her. We're going to do a good chat about the Consortium of Overseas Student Teachers, also known as COST, which is the program that provides this service for these young teachers in university to be able to go overseas, have that placement, get that experience, and bring that international experience back into their classrooms once they graduate. And on a side note, this gets at Dannielle making the pivot, returning back to the U.S. from being an international educator to a new job, and in this case, moving into higher education. I think you really will enjoy this show, and if you've got children who are moving into college and university thinking about being teachers, this is definitely something to share with them. This episode was recorded on December 12th, 2022. Hello and howdy, Dannielle. I understand that you've been visiting my backyard in the Deep South. So welcome to the podcast. And where in the world exactly are you?
Hey, David. Hey, Audrey. Good to see you both here. Thanks for having me. I am currently in Hattiesburg, Mississippi at the University of Southern Mississippi. It's an overcast, sort of dreary, warm day in the Deep South.
Well, congratulations on starting there after getting your doctorate from the University of Georgia. That's a huge accomplishment. So let's move to the next stage of our podcast where we ask folks to share a going global story. So do you have one for us?
Yes, David, I do. My going global story starts in high school when I had an opportunity. I was at Farmington High School in Connecticut, and we had a chance to live with a family for a couple of weeks in France. And I went to a French high school for about 2 weeks and gained the appreciation and inspiration to want to continue having experiences abroad and to learn all that I could in different areas of the world. And so that sparked my wanting to also go abroad. And I went twice to study abroad in college at the University of Connecticut. And then I've researched with teacher candidates from the University of Georgia. And we all had this commonality of having this first experience that was really foundational in our desire to want to continue pursuing opportunities abroad to learn and all of that stuff.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. So, we have a guiding question for our session today, and then we have some sub questions. So, first, let's start with the guiding question because, we're teachers. What does teaching overseas look like for teacher candidates in university who are enrolled in your program? That's our overall question. And the first sub question of that is, could you tell us about the consortium of colleges and universities that offer overseas teaching opportunities? And what's their mission? What's it like?
Yeah. So the first part of the guiding question, to talk about the guiding question, our listeners might be wondering, who are teacher candidates? What is that? So just to explain what that is, a teacher candidate is an undergraduate student who wants to be a teacher. And so, they've mainly finished their prerequisite courses before entering into their education courses. And so They're known as teacher candidates because they are going to be teachers. And I learned of this really amazing opportunity at the University of Georgia called the Consortium of Overseas Student Teachers. And so the acronym is COST. It's called the COST program. And when I was asking about different opportunities that teacher candidates in our teacher preparation program had to go abroad. When I was at the University of Connecticut, I was also in a teacher preparation program. And because it becomes sort of a more lockstep program with certain courses, the opportunity that I had to study abroad needed to be before my education courses. From that experience in high school, I knew I wanted to do it. So it's like, here I am already looking for opportunities. So I better go in the time that I can before I start my education courses. So I did that. I studied abroad as a sophomore. So when I was at the University of Georgia and I found out that student teaching happens in the last semester of your teacher preparation program. It's like the semester before you become certified, and then, you start looking for jobs and all that kind of thing. So the program at the University of Georgia is a great program for teacher candidates. And when I learned that you could actually complete half of your student teaching in a different country, I wanted to learn more about that. And so this sparked this research interest within me to learn more about the Consortium of Overseas Student Teaching, what it was, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also, who goes abroad? Can I talk to anybody? Can I track down people who are in their student teaching right now abroad? And so I did those things and I learned quite a lot. So, Audrey, to share with you about what COST is, the Consortium of Overseas Student Teaching is run out of Grand Valley State in Michigan. They have sort of a base there. And the overall mission of the program is, in addition to all of the requirements that teacher candidates have, such as certain portfolios that they need to complete, observations by their student teaching supervisors, all of that stuff. The mission really is to also gain new perspectives on world events and an appreciation of, the host country wherever student teachers are placed. And they can choose where they want to go to an extent. And then also just expanding their perspectives of themselves and others, different sociocultural contexts, socio-historical contexts, and consider ways of bringing international perspectives back into their own classrooms when they eventually have one. So there's just so many things that I learned from my student teachers, my research participants that I worked with, that I was like, oh, I wish everybody who wanted to could have this kind of an opportunity.
Honestly, if I had had that opportunity, I would have jumped at the chance. I think it's just fabulous that it's offered at all. I love it.
Oh, could I add a couple of things,
Yeah, of
Audrey?
course.
Just there are 16 universities
Right.
that are a part of COST.
Mhm.
There's only 16 throughout the United States. And I just happened to be at University of Georgia and University of Southern Mississippi. And I'm able to talk to the teacher candidates that I just finished up with. They're in their second semester of the program. So they have one more semester before they need to decide what they want to do for student teaching. And I've talked to them about this, and so hopefully a couple will come through, because I think for some of them, balancing their lives and, just I'm actually wondering myself, if you haven't yet had that first experience and this is your first experience, it's kind of that going global story is really important. How do you get there? And so it is my hope that here at the University of Southern Mississippi, we can talk with our teacher candidates in a way and help them understand the program so that it's something that they really want to try.
Yeah, to add to what you're saying, the whole going global for me, I wasn't ready initially. I mean, I knew about it because I went to Queen's University and it was part of the teacher placement program, but I didn't feel like I could go to a whole new country and learn to teach all at the same time. So, is there any way they can defer that international option until they've had a bit of experience, or is it either, right at the end of your program or the university doesn't really facilitate it?
That's such a great question, Audrey. I think that's where I feel like in some ways having that prior experience ends up becoming important because you're more likely to want to tack on an international experience and use it within the context of learning to teach, which it's kind of like two things at once. And so for this particular program, there would not be an opportunity to go abroad, say with like cost or defer, unless the teacher candidate took a semester off or something like that, like paused their program. But that is not to say that there aren't other opportunities within universities for study abroad. So it may not necessarily be this student teaching experience,
Right.
but that most likely would have had to have been something before student teaching. So I think this is why it's a particular niche, I would almost say,
Uh-huh.
of teacher candidates that have had at least an experience abroad that is propelling them to want to continue to learn. And then also in this teaching capacity, if that makes sense.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think you're right that if I had had the internship abroad, then I might have felt like, okay, yeah, I get what it is. I can handle it and been ready to start off my first classroom being abroad. It's just, I had zero teaching experience at the beginning, but then I went a couple of years later.
Yeah.
So it worked out.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's great that you're thinking about those questions.
Oh, thanks.
So, what I'm hearing is very much an experiential learning opportunity and a lot of personal growth. And as so many K through 12 international schools, they want to raise global citizens and that awareness and perspective. And gosh, this is just fantastic that you all are doing that. So, your goals and your mission seem pretty clear. I'm wondering if there's some goals on the instruction and curriculum learning, classroom management, because I'm kind of thinking what Audrey's saying. I'm trying to picture being like 20, 21 years old, going to a whole another country without a lot of experience and going into the classroom working with a partner teacher. Are there some instruction, class management kind of goals as well for these students?
That's a really good point, David. That was also raised in my research and talking with the student teachers that I interviewed. So basically, I had a bunch of questions and interviewed student teachers that had this experience in classrooms. So, just a little bit of background, the research participants that I worked with, who I'm still in touch with, a few of them, two of them student taught in New Zealand. One of them student taught in Ecuador, and the other student taught in Costa Rica. And, there is preparation beforehand in the class program. So there's like a pre-departure meeting. And actually, teacher candidates have an essay that they write. It's like an application and it gets sent to Grand Valley State. So, for example, there were in 2022 about 40 student teachers that went abroad and student taught. So if that gives us a picture of, 40 students throughout the United States who had done this. So it is a very particular program. And within the pre-departure meeting, they do talk about the host country and even culture shock. Audrey, I know when we went abroad, part of the thing it gives you the list of what culture shock is like and so forth.
Yeah.
And what is interesting about this program, it's almost like a hybrid between teacher education and study abroad. And so what ends up happening is the teacher candidates, by the time they get to student teaching, they've had, some exposure to international education, potentially, not all programs, but I know, for example, at the University of Georgia, my teacher candidates had already heard about Reggio Emilia. And so Peyton, and I've got pseudonyms for my teacher candidates, so I can say the pseudonyms. I'm not going to use their real name. But so Peyton, as she named herself, when she went to Costa Rica, like first week she was there, she was like, this is a Reggio Emilia classroom, because she had already
Nice.
learned about that in some of the earlier courses at the University of Georgia. So that's not necessarily everywhere, but it's interesting also the student teachers that want to do this because in some ways there is a reason why they're wanting to do it. They're generally like characteristically very motivated people. adventurous, have a lot of support to do those kinds of things, whether it be economic or just through their family members have done this kind of thing in the past. And so they come in with some sort of idea of what classrooms look like because they've also had classroom experience in the US. So they've been in like these practicum placements and so forth, like field placements. And so I do think, and part of my research looks at what kind of lens do student teachers come in with for looking at classrooms and how does that interact with a classroom that is unfamiliar in a different country with different cultural norms, with different mentor teachers that they are going to have to build a relationship with in order to be involved with the classroom. So it is interesting to note that the student teaching semester is about 14 to 15 weeks. And so if you are splitting up that time, the first part of student teaching is usually done in the US. So you've got about 6 weeks that you're in the US student teacher, making lesson plans, doing all these kinds of things. And then it's after that when you go to your country. And so you have about, on average, it's about 6 weeks in the other country. And so there's one university supervisor usually helping the student teacher. They come in and do the observations and so forth. And so sometimes where a disconnect can happen is when the university supervisor, say at the University of Georgia, has their teacher candidate in the cost program and they're finishing up their semester abroad. The supervisor doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to go and see the teacher candidate in that country. That would be awesome if they could. And I would love to do that.
I was going to say, how do I get that job?
I know, right? But, with technology and all of that, I mean, depending on the time zone, but we've got videos now. We have all of this where the supervisor can watch what's happening within the classroom for an observation or so forth. But teacher candidates I go in between teacher candidates and student teachers. I mean, student teachers. They're similar yet a little different. But the student teachers are also writing reflections to their university supervisor, talking about the things that are happening. And so as I was doing my research, I did notice some areas where the cost program could provide some additional support given there was more time and kind of stuff like that. But having the candidates learn maybe more about the history of the place or the school or whatever. But that's just kind of my research emphasis and emerging scholarly research agenda anyway. But I think talking with the teacher candidates or the student teachers about their experience, there was so much learning happening that they talked about that I think what emerged from our conversation and what I'm really just so happy that this podcast does is talk about these experiences. They really wanted a place to dialogue about it and what they were learning and, what was happening there or certain things that I think they were a little unsure of, they wanted to talk about. But then also the things that they realized that they were like, oh my gosh, I can do this a different way. And it doesn't have to be like this back in the US, having to do with classroom management or, like an emphasis on play. Peyton noticed that in Costa Rica and how at her school, and actually Sabine in Ecuador noticed how even in kindergarten, she felt like the students were really in charge of their learning. And she felt like that was sort of a disconnect from a teacher-centric experience that she had in some of her other classrooms back in the US. And it was just a really cool way for them to kind of have this other perspective introduced to them and what to do with that.
Yeah, that's the thing. It can only make us better as teachers. It can broaden our horizons. And there might be things they see that they say, oh, I don't think I'd want to do that. But just the more exposure you can get and getting the other cultural perspective is just gravy,
Yeah.
Since you mentioned economics, I'm just going to probe that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all self-funded by the students, these trips, and the university just sets them up with the opportunity. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's a really good point. And let me just get a little bit of what I had with the cost estimate, because finances will always be a constraint if that's a big part of it.
Right.
And through my research, I was looking at who has the opportunities to go abroad, because that's also important. And from the way the teacher candidates explained it to me, and I'd have to go back and look a little bit further, the estimated cost of attendance for cost was actually not that much more expensive than being at their regular university.
Really?
Yeah, which was really interesting for them to talk about, because you're paying regular tuition to your university. So you're not paying extra for the tuition,
Mm-hmm.
all of your fees. So the things that are included in cost that teacher candidates would need to pay for would be a supervision and placement fee. You pay for the airfare, and expenses have gone up, I would say. So you've got round trip airfare, passport, depending on if you have one or not, if you need the visa or immigration fee. There's a study abroad health. There's professional liability insurance, which on this cost estimate says $10, but I don't know what that would be.
What is that all about? Right?
I don't know. And then it says varies by provider, so I'm not sure. But I'm not going to be an expert in any of this. You'd have to ask the cost program and so forth. But you potentially, if you're living off campus, you are going to not pay that. If you can have someone either sublet your lease or whatever, you hope you're not necessarily paying for two places, but room and board is with a family. And so you're paying for that. And they estimate around 2,000 here. And so they have a grand total, and that's not necessarily going to mean anything in the context of what we're talking about, but you want to bring in some additional money for yourself too. So it adds up. I remember one of my research participants saying that it didn't seem like it was that much more from where she was, but I don't know if she was living in a really expensive place in Athens.
Exactly.
And there you go. However, here at the University of Southern Mississippi, as I've talked with admissions people and so forth, looking for opportunities for scholarships and all of that stuff within going abroad is also a piece of thinking about these things, because I think it's great to have the opportunity, but how are you going to pay for it?
Right. And that can limit people who don't have the means. So it does sound like it may be inequitable to a certain extent. And I'm really glad to hear that you're looking into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a line of research that follows that, I believe, out of Georgia State and so forth. So when we're talking about the types of opportunities that going abroad provides just for people in general, you don't necessarily want money to be the factor that's the barrier, but here we are.
Yeah, it's reality.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the opportunity is there for those who are able to take it. We're wondering about what kind of structures and systems help guide the participants as they prepare for these opportunities.
So teacher candidates apply to cost, and based on their acceptance, which I do think most teacher candidates that apply are accepted, or that's what I've heard. I don't know for a fact if that's true, but I do think those that do apply have the background that they're looking for in someone who is going to be okay with being outside of their home country, also in the context within building their professional identity, which is kind of like two things at once. I know teaching abroad, it was one of those things where I felt confident with teaching because I had taught back in the US for, 7 years before I went
Exactly.
overseas. So that whole process is something to definitely consider. And so there's an orientation meeting. If you're going pre-departure, there's a whole bunch of, in case of illness, just a lot of the nitty gritty stuff that I think teachers also receive for teaching abroad. Like, these are the documents you need to carry. These are the pre-departure travel list, checklists of things, registering with the embassy, health, which is important. And I would also say mental health as well. And then advice for a successful cost experience, such as doing research, being flexible, open-minded, prepared to adjust to the culture and norms. So through some of the research that I've done, What's interesting about the COST program is student teachers are largely independent. And what I mean by that is they're all set up through the COST program. They know who their family is, they've got their ticket, someone's going to be picking them up at the airport, those kinds of things. They have a mentor teacher arranged for them. The part that is largely independent is by that time, their university supervisor isn't with them. But if that communication is strong from stateside, the university supervisor, and then the teacher candidate is sending in their reflections, and those kinds of conversations can occur and can potentially help the student teacher process potentially some of the things happening in placement. I have not heard of many unsuccessful experiences, because it does seem like once the student teacher is there, it's like, oh my gosh, my mentor teacher, was ready for me and has the student teachers working in the classroom. But what was interesting, a lot of them told me, was it didn't necessarily feel like student teaching anymore, because what they had done was they were planning all of these lessons back in the States and knew those students. But when you go to a completely different country, completely different classroom, you're starting at day one again and building those relationships and having a flexible mindset to pick up on some of the nuanced things happening in the classroom. That's something that the university supervisor structures, like what observations are you making? What are the similarities and differences that you're seeing between classrooms? What sort of interesting things are sticking out? And I think that a lot of times student teachers can feel on their own. I mean, sometimes they're going to have another student teacher from a different university with them at that school. So you have different international schools throughout the COST program who they're affiliated with. But other times, student teachers can be largely on their own. And what I would say is some jump right into the classroom and their mentor teacher's like, hey, can you teach this lesson? And they're ready to jump in.
Wow.
I ended up being the university supervisor of one of the students. I didn't do research with her, but I was her supervisor. So I kind of knew what she was doing. She sent so many amazing things about the things that she was doing. She was planning all these lessons. This is the best experience ever. I could travel this place. It was kind of one of those things.
That's awesome. But you're right. It does sound like it takes a certain kind of person to want to do this.
Yeah.
They have that mindset. It's a little bit reminiscent of Peace Corps.
Yes.
People that survive are those who have that openness to new experiences and the courage. Really, it takes courage to go off and learn your trade in a completely different environment. Maybe you don't speak the language. I think it's cool that they're being hosted with local people, because that would really give them insights into the culture that just are going to further their experience. But I mean, personally, I remember getting on that flight to Ethiopia by myself, and I was pretty nervous about that. So I was grateful that I already had the teaching experience. But I think it's different knowing you're going to have your own classroom versus being a student teacher, because there's that sense of comfort. So I think that whom the university chooses or accepts as mentor teachers is going to really matter. Do you mind taking a sec to, if you have the information, delve a little bit into how that works? How do you manage to get these teacher mentors? And is there a vetting process, or how does that work?
Absolutely. I do not know too much about how it works in individual places, but I have gotten feedback about what that's like. And I do know a little bit about what happens here stateside as well, because that mentor teacher really is super important in the student teacher's experience. So I believe the COST program, they'll have site supervisors for the different countries. And you can go onto the COST website and see the different countries where student teachers are able to have their experience student teaching. So there's this list of countries where you can try to student teach. I wouldn't really be able to speak to how the process works, but what I do know from here in the States is that's going to happen on a building level. So principals would most likely be involved with liaisoning with the university, and who is open to having a practicum student, a student teacher from the United States. And for some mentor teachers, it's really a help to them, but also somebody for their students to also learn from too and build a relationship with. And I just remember the student teachers that I interviewed with, they talked about how much the students in the classroom were excited to have them and wanted to be their friend. And this is my teacher from the United States, and tried to build some pen pal correspondence between the student teachers, students from their first placement in the US, and then the next students that they had in whichever country they were in. And the mentor teachers allowed that type of thing. And so I think there's a voluntary side for the mentor teachers to have student teachers from the United States come and stay with them in their classroom. And so, dependent on whichever country is open to having student teachers from the US, I think there's a mutual willingness to engage in cross-cultural learning and so forth.
I'm hearing so much of the tool of reflection that the program uses. And I'll come back to that term of experiential learning. And again, I'm picturing what it's like to be as an individual young woman or young man in another country and trying to connect to a friend group. And as you say, a lot of it comes back to the individual and just what are their character strengths and resilience. And doesn't mean if you don't have a lot of resilience, you can't do it. You can grow your resilience, right? So that's what experiential education is all about. So kind of connecting to that, what are examples of participants when they come back and they report about their overseas schools? What are some of the lessons that they're bringing back and sharing? That's maybe divided into life lessons and classroom lessons. What are you picking up there?
Just to reiterate, it's a very small number of people that I've talked with, and I hope to have more. And there is a body of research that has looked into cost student experiences, and I can actually talk a little bit about that work and then the anecdotal interview stuff that I've heard. Pence and McGillivray, there's a couple of researchers, they talked about student teachers learning new pedagogies, observing new pedagogies in their student teaching classroom, preparation to work with diverse learners, personal growth, and I'll talk a little bit about that, increased self and cultural awareness, and then also a whole host of other resiliency things that you were talking about, David. When the student teachers were talking to me, I think what stood out to them the most, or definitely Sabine, who I kind of researched or I wrote about more in depth, she talked about her time in Ecuador and how she kind of set little benchmarks for herself. And these are some of the personal things. I mean, think about being abroad as a woman, as a young woman. I mean, there are safety concerns to be thinking about in a different place and so forth. And her host family had urged her to get a cab. She didn't have a car or anything. And so that personal freedom of calling a cab and going to the place that she wanted to go, to the mall, she asked some other student teachers to meet her there. And when it happened and worked, she felt personally accomplished in that thing.
I love that intentionality.
Yeah, she's amazing. She was talking about how, and everything was in Spanish. And so part of her story was that she had traveled abroad on some service trips beforehand to Honduras and so forth. And so she knew that she liked the area. So it started off with that. And then it was the initiative to take larger trips with friends. So it started off small, and these little victories in her mind led her to bigger things that she was able to experience personally. For her, pedagogy wise, it's like we're working with diverse learners here in the United States, and for her to be immersed within the Spanish language with her students, it brought to life what her classes at the University of Georgia were teaching about teaching English learners. And so they were learning English in the class in Ecuador. And seeing the pedagogies, like the visual aspects, and how her teacher worked with her students to help pronunciation wise or whatever it was, she felt, especially with small groups and different things like that, I think what she learned about, she was able to see in practice in another setting that really enriched what she wanted to do when she came back, especially with English learners, I guess you could say. Having that experience was what boosted her confidence, I would say. Language skills, confidence. And another part too is there's a lot of kind of tensions within US society too about our own socio-historical, socio-cultural context that she also observed within private schools and equity and all this kind of thing. And it really raised some questions about her role in the US, who she was, what kind of privileges she brought to the table as well. So recognizing within herself that she also was in this privileged position even to be able to go abroad in the first place. So I think that kind of self-awareness and criticality brings to your teaching a level of wisdom that I think was gained being able to have the experience in a different country.
So cool. And it really highlights the importance of the reflection piece, as David was saying. My understanding of how the brain works, David, you might correct me because you're the big researcher on these kind of things, but the reflection piece is where we do a large portion of the actual learning. And so it's great to hear that their reflections, at least in Sabine's case, were so deep and meaningful. And really, I think that will serve her well in the future. So it's daunting for a teacher candidate, but it's also daunting for the mentor, of course. And we're wondering if in your preparation, the extent to which you encourage the student teachers to take an active role versus being an observer. Do they have specific guidelines around that, or does it depend on their mentor teacher and what their expectations are?
That's something that came out in my research as well about how some of the teacher candidates wished in some ways that there was more definition around what they needed to do
Mm-hmm.
because it ended up becoming variable along the mentor teacher lines, which gives a certain level of freedom. But then also, if you're having trouble either building that relationship or the mentor teacher has a lot on their plate,
Mm-hmm.
and then the teacher candidate kind of feels like an afterthought, or the student teacher. And so a student teacher did bring up to me how she wished that there was some different assignments because there was another student from a different place, not actually from the US, who had to do, this set math lesson and this set, certain things within the classroom. And because that was already set out for them, they could tell that mentor teacher, like, hey, I have to do this. Whereas I think from what we're used to at the universities, I think this is an area where we can grow, particularly within the cost program of, okay, so we recognize that within student teaching, you have 2 observations and a debrief and these kinds of things. But it can depend on the supervisor. It can depend on the different universities and the teacher preparation program. So there's a lot of variability, I would say, even between teacher preparation programs in the United States. But one thing that I do, for example, as a supervisor of a practicum placement, I have a list of suggestions, which I actually got from a well-respected colleague of mine who was at the University of Georgia. She had a list of different levels of things that you can do within the classroom, that level 1 activities, level 2 activities, level 3, so that teacher candidates feel as if they have suggestions of things that they could do, but they're not interfering with their mentor teacher per se. So it's like suggestions for, and I don't mean interfering with the mentor teacher as causing some kind of problem, but some of them are a little more shy than others. And so I would say a list of things that they could feel that they're helping their mentor teacher in a way that is conducive within the classroom and sort of being visible and interactive and taking initiative, but not like,
Yeah, it gives them some agency.
yeah, Exactly. Exactly. And because some of them, they're going to most likely, on the whole, the student teachers that go abroad are very self-motivated and so forth and courageous, but they're also really respectful too. And they don't want to overstep in a way that is not conducive to cultural norms or anything like that.
Absolutely. I'm curious if that list or a similar list gets shared with the mentor teacher, because it'd be nice if they were able to interact with that and say, hey, student X, I'm comfortable with you doing a level 2 today, or what have you.
That's a great idea, Audrey. Love it. I agree.
Okay.
I think that's also where the cost program, I think that interaction between, say, the US and the host country, I feel like that communication piece is really important and doesn't necessarily always get emphasized, because it's like, we have students coming over and then it's like, is that the end of our partnership? Or, it shouldn't be.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because being a mentor teacher is no small thing.
Yeah.
As we all know, just having someone in your room just already feels a little, for some people, invasive, unsettling. And so to know the extent to which they were going to participate and exactly what kind of, like you said, the student that was able to come in and say, these are the expectations that I have on my end, in a way that's nice for the mentor teacher to know, okay, then we can work with that. Whereas if it's just inventing the wheel from scratch, that's always more daunting. So, yeah, I appreciate that thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the teacher candidates that I have here at the University of Southern Mississippi, I have questions. If I haven't brought it up yet, it's like, we're feeling a little concerned. We don't want to step on toes in our mentor teacher's classroom and so forth. So when I provided them, say this semester, with that sheet of level 1 activities, level 2, level 3, they felt so much more guidance on having agency themselves, that let them feel like they had a purpose there too, not just always observing. Because that, as the mentor teacher, you could also be like, what are they thinking? What do they
Hmm.
think about this kind of thing?
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that's fantastic. And yeah, communication is key.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And making everybody feel comfortable. Like, what is this thing? Let's define
Mhm.
it. Let's talk about it. Let's not just assume that everyone knows what's going on. And I think having that dialogue between the mentor teacher and the student teacher can really smooth the pathway so that they feel comfortable. Okay, I know that he or she is comfortable with me doing whatever level on whatever day at whatever point in time. And I think that can only be good.
Absolutely. Definitely.
So, Audrey, I thought you brought up really excellent points there. And what's popping in my head is the opportunity to create a handbook if there's not one there already. And with your new eyes coming to the program, Dannielle, I can see you just keeping like a Google Doc where you just keep throwing ideas and strategies, because there's so many moving parts to what's going on that you're talking about. And just as you're saying, a 21-year-old in another country and doesn't want to step on the toes of the teacher, but you're giving them a common language, as Audrey points out, if the teacher has those levels, and just whatever strategies that can be shared to continue that communication and understanding. So I apologize. I'm in a co-working site in southern Mexico, and there's a big truck outside, so we're going to get through this. I did want to ask a question, but it's a big one that you can just kind of pass on. I'm just wondering, with the pandemic, and I know you were at Georgia previously, now you're at Southern Mississippi, what your numbers have looked like. Has there been a change in applicants with the current class that's gone out or going out this year? Is there the same enthusiasm? Is the program going strong?
It was interesting. I was in my my doctoral program during COVID, and I was also teaching teacher candidates who were looking forward to student teaching abroad. This was one of their things that they really wanted to do. And I did a little bit of research before coming on, and you can actually find it on the COST website. They had an annual meeting with their minutes posted from 2021, and there was interest. It's kind of a small program, but I do think that the interest is pretty steady for the people that want to do it. And so when we're thinking about COVID, student teachers were ready to go for the fall of 2021. And there were certain places, certain host countries that moved to a level 4 advisory with COVID. And so the home institutions, the universities, had to go back and check their policies to see if they could send their student teachers to the place. Like, had there been any revisions or whatever? That interest was still really high. I know personally one of my teacher candidates, actually, Audrey, I've put you in touch with her, was still, a lot of them were still able to student teach in the fall of 2021. And so I do think that there were definitely wrenches thrown in. One of my research participants was actually, so this is one of those success stories where she student taught abroad and then accepted the job afterwards in New Zealand.
Woo-woo.
So that's the one I can speak to, that I do know that she taught overseas after her student teaching experience right away.
I mean, New
Yeah,
Zealand, who wouldn't?
exactly.
Hello.
Yeah. I mean, she, and I am still in touch with her. I was invited to her wedding.
In New Zealand?
No, it wasn't there. She had come back
Oh,
because when COVID hit, New Zealand closed.
shut
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. And so she had come back in March, and she told me that whole story because her then fiance was there as well. And he ended up getting transferred back to the US. And so had my research participant stayed, she probably would have had to have stayed for a while. But she did say so much about how this school was just an amazing school to learn. Audrey, she was in the flexible classroom. She was teaching with a lot of other teachers in front of them, as flexible learning goes. And she just learned so much also with culturally responsive teaching there and so forth. And so I think she was in Auckland, and she even gave me the book of her school, and she wanted to try to implement some of this stuff back here in Georgia when she came back. And so I haven't talked to her in a while, but David, to get back to the question that you had asked, I do think that there were definitely challenges during COVID, that because this type of experience, the people who are interested in it, that desire is so strong that it overrides the challenges. Like we talk about resiliency, and they wanted to just do it still. And I know that there were instances where they were able to, and then I'm not sure about who didn't get to go. But I have a feeling, I don't know if this is true or not, but I do think applications will continue to come in for the cost program. But that's really dependent, I think, on what our student teachers' situations are, because a lot of them that we're seeing now were in high school when COVID hit and so forth. And I do think there's sort of a bottleneck of experiences that were not able to occur during that time, and then where we are now. So when we're thinking about that going global experience, I don't know if they weren't able to have certain going global experiences because of that. So who knows? It's a work in progress. But after this podcast, I think I want to make sure I'm in touch with our program director for the cost program, who's wonderful. I'm actually in her old office.
Oh, fun.
But to see, do we have anybody who's applied and so forth, and really getting that word out. This is actually the postcard where I was at a recruiting event in Southern Mississippi about what our University of Southern Mississippi teacher preparation program is like. And I was able to talk about the cost program, how we're one of 16 universities in the United States that offer this experience that's not offered everywhere. And if we can make the finances work, it's just totally worth the cost and time and effort to try to do it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic program. And we are hopeful that in the future it can continue to grow.
Yeah.
So, along a similar line, do you have any idea of how many, sometimes in the business world, they call them conversions, how many of these pre-service teachers end up taking jobs overseas? Do you have any data on that?
I have wanted to gather data on that. This is I would say, systemic issue that we come up against in the teacher ed world, is that oftentimes it can be a challenge to follow our teacher candidate after they've had their first job. So we may have data on where they've ended up, but then if they transfer or move from there, we're not exactly sure. We don't necessarily have the longevity data there, or the longitudinal. But I do think if people were intentional about trying to gather that research, and some of that's going to be grassroots and just having their contacts and sort of this snowball effect of finding
Right.
out where people are at. So I don't have any hard data on that, but anecdotally, I know two of the research participants that I talked to and am still in touch with are actively looking for jobs abroad, teaching abroad. And a lot of them come to me because they've had an experience with me working with them in the university, but they also know that I taught in Singapore. And to them, that's the biggest thing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, we also have someone that we could suggest you send them to, and her name is Jacqueline Malay, and she has been an international teacher for 20 years, and she is now a teacher consultant. And so she helps people set up their resume and cover letter and works with them on interviewing and gives them advice on the schools that they've selected as to some things to look at and whether those would be a good fit or not. And so that's something to throw out there as a possibility for these people, especially going overseas for the first time. It can be daunting in so many ways. So to just have someone to work with you on those details is a really nice idea.
Oh, definitely. Yes.
Audrey, I would add there's another resource out there on the internet. It's called educatorsgoingglobal.com.
I hear it's awesome.
I do. I do. I hear it's doing pretty well. And that would be a terrific place for these young teachers, about to be teachers. Maybe they get a couple of years experience and then they're ready to spread their wings and go overseas. So we will be here on the internet for them. And people like Jacqueline are always ready to help in that process of recruiting and making that transition overseas. So, Dannielle, we've covered so much and we've put you under the microscope. This has not been easy, and we really appreciate your insights. Is there anything else that you would like to cover that we haven't mentioned or you haven't mentioned yet?
Yes, part of the research that I also engage in are equitable opportunities, critical reflection, these kinds of things that really are aspects to home teaching back here in the US that are so important to where we are as a country. And so that fit between going abroad and then also coming home. I mean, there's that opportunity to go back and forth and what that does for a person. And I would say, in my own experience, and maybe I'm being a little too open here, but and David, I talked to you about how I taught in DC. I was at a point when I was just burnt out or whatever it was. And there were things going on in education here that I became kind of like just a little bit down about. And the Singapore American School was right there. And somehow it was one of those things where things just clicked when they needed to. And so, in a way, I consider the Singapore American School my light that reignited my recognition for why I was going into teaching in the first place. And all of these things that I was able to do, I could see what was possible within education. And so, in a way, that's why I do what I do now, because I'm helping prepare new teachers. And teaching, it's not an easy job. It's hard. You can get bogged down with lesson plans and parents and the nitty gritty everyday stuff. And I think sometimes being able to get outside of your own bubble and not necessarily feel the same pressures, I think can be a way to kind of refresh your perspective on what is possible and then kind of spread that to other people, whether you're abroad or you come home or whatever
And I love that you raised that, because that's part of our reason for being here, Educators Going Global, is to suggest to people that if you are getting bogged down in some of those difficulties, that if you take it overseas, a lot of times in these schools, there's more respect for teachers. There are fewer mandated programs, standards, or what have you that you have to reach to. There's a lot more trust in your professionalism. So you have more flexibility to try out some of these ideas, that the reasons you got into teaching in the first place. And so thank you for that little plump for international teaching, because that's what we're here for.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is why we're all here too. This is our commonality. And it's a special bond because you just don't realize what is out there or what is possible. And it's really just a great experience.
Absolutely. So can you tell our listeners where they could follow you or reach out to you if they wanted more information about your programs or cost or...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not the biggest social media person, but I do have a Twitter handle. It's at dcarrier17. But then I also am here at the University of Southern Mississippi. If anybody has any questions, I always answer back to anyone who wants to talk about international teaching. So my email address is just my name, Danielle.Carrier@usm.edu. And the Grand Valley State University website, just search the cost program. That has an abundance of resources on what the cost program is, which universities are part of it. And I'm on the faculty webpage. You can see my research and so forth.
Most excellent. And I'm sitting here thinking, I used to do a podcast with Mark Hofer. He's a professor at the School of Education at William & Mary in Virginia. And he was always my go-to guy to find out what was happening in higher ed and teacher preparation programs. And right now, I'm incredibly curious about what's happening with our teacher education programs, because it's been such a slog and difficult time for educators through the pandemic. And so many of the difficulties that were there when I started 40 years ago are still there, and now they're in some ways much worse. A lot of societal things going on for sure. So I'm pretty excited that you're going to be our second go-to person to talk about teacher preparation programs. We'll give you a little bit more time at your new university there, but we'll definitely be coming back to chat with you about the big picture of pre-service and then about the cost program and what you're seeing and what you're learning. So thank you so much for coming on, and we'll definitely have you back on for some periodic check-ins.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.